SpaceX just confirmed it. Flight 13, July. Flight 14, August. 2 Starship launches, back to back. But here's what nobody's talking about. NASA's moon plan just got flipped upside down. The rocket that was built to go to the moon, it's not going to the moon anymore. SLS now stops at low Earth orbit. That's it. So how does an astronaut get to the lunar surface? They dock with Starship, in space, a vehicle that has never carried a single human being. An estimated $4 billion per SLS launch, according to NASA's own Inspector General. And it's now basically a taxi to a parking lot. This changes everything. Stay with me. Let's go back to 2011. NASA officially retired the space shuttle. And for the first time in half a century, America had no rocket capable of carrying humans beyond low Earth orbit. So Congress did what Congress does. They wrote a check. A very, very large check. The Space Launch System, SLS, was born. Budget, around $23 billion over the next decade. Goal? Simple. Build the most powerful rocket America has ever made. Send astronauts back to the moon. Reclaim the glory days of Apollo. It took 11 years to get the first one off the ground. 11 years. For context, SpaceX built the Falcon 9 from scratch in about 4 years, and they've now launched it over 300 times. But SLS finally flew in November 2022. No crew, just a test, and it worked. The rocket was real. The dream seemed back on track. Then something shifted, quietly, slowly. And now, in June 2025, NASA has revealed something that nobody who cheered for SLS in 2022 expected to hear. And the details of what replaced that plan will surprise you. The Artemis plan. Nobody voted for. Here's what Artemis 3 was always supposed to look like. SLS launches from Kennedy Space Center. It carries the Orion spacecraft, with 4 astronauts inside, directly toward the moon. They cruise for 3 days. They enter lunar orbit. A lunar lander comes up to meet them. 2 astronauts climb down. They walk on the moon. Historic moment. Roll credits. That was the plan. This is what's actually happening now. SLS launches, but it only goes to low Earth orbit. That's roughly 400 kilometers above Earth. That's where the International Space Station is. That's not even close to the moon. The Orion spacecraft separates. Then it docks, in low Earth orbit, with a completely different vehicle. A vehicle built by Blue Origin. Something NASA insiders are describing as a Franken spacecraft. That's not a joke. That is the actual term being used internally. It has a Blue Moon Mark II crew cabin on top. But underneath, a custom propulsion module that nobody has ever flown before. No cryogenic engines. No BE-7 engines that Blue Origin spent years developing. Just a one-of-a-kind structure that exists solely to test whether astronauts can live and work inside this thing for up to 90 days. 90 days. In low Earth orbit. Not on the moon. Not even heading toward the moon. And here's the detail buried in the fine print. This Blue Moon hybrid vehicle, it's not dependent on New Glenn. Blue Origin's own rocket. NASA confirmed it could launch on almost any rocket wide enough to carry it. Read that again. The vehicle designed to carry NASA astronauts toward the moon can launch on a competitor's rocket. It doesn't need to wait for Blue Origin's schedule. It doesn't need to wait for New Glenn to be reliable. Why does that matter? Because New Glenn has had a rough start. Its first launch in January 2025 succeeded in reaching orbit, but failed to land the booster. And right now, nobody outside Blue Origin knows exactly when it will fly again with full confidence. So NASA built a lunar mission that doesn't depend on any single company. Smart, or desperate, or both. Where does Starship fit in all of this? Here's where it gets genuinely wild. After Orion docks with the Blue Moon hybrid in low Earth orbit, after they've tested the interior, tested the life support, tested the operations, SpaceX launches a Starship, a standard Starship, version 3, with a docking port attached, and the crew doesn't board it. They fly Orion alongside it. They dock with it. They inspect it from the outside. And then they undock. And Starship comes back down to land, hopefully, at the launch site. That's it. Why? Because before you send 4 human beings to the surface of the moon inside a 50-meter-tall rocket, you probably want to know that it can dock reliably, that it behaves predictably in space, and that it can actually land back on Earth without incident. Which brings us to Flight 13 and Flight 14. SpaceX confirmed, during the IPO period, that Starship Flight 13 is targeting July 2025. Flight 14 is targeting August 2025. Back-to-back, 1 month apart. That pace alone is extraordinary. No rocket in history has ever attempted orbital test flights at that frequency during active development. The Space Shuttle flew once every 54 days on average, and that was a mature, fully operational vehicle supported by an army of technicians. SpaceX is trying to iterate on Starship the same way a software company pushes code updates. Fast, aggressive, accept some failures. Learn, fix, launch again. But the question hanging over all of this is simple. Are they moving fast enough? Before we get excited about Flight 13, let's be honest about what happened on Flight 12. The vehicle performed better than any previous Starship flight. The Super Heavy booster was caught, again, by the mechanical arms at the launch tower. That's a feat of engineering that still sounds impossible when you say it out loud. A rocket booster, the size of a 20-story building, falling from the edge of space, caught by 2 giant metal arms. And it worked, twice now. But the upper stage, the ship itself, had issues on re-entry. There was excessive heating. There were anomalies. The ship did not survive the way SpaceX needed it to survive. Here's why that matters directly for the Artemis timeline. For Starship to dock with Orion in low Earth orbit, for humans to ever trust their lives to this vehicle, it has to demonstrate controlled, repeatable, survivable re-entry every single time, without exception. Flight 13 needs to show that SpaceX fixed the re-entry problem. If it doesn't, Flight 14 becomes a scramble. And the Artemis 3 timeline, which NASA is already threading through an impossibly narrow window, starts to unravel fast. So when SpaceX says July for Flight 13, the entire Artemis program is quietly watching. This isn't just another test flight. This is the audition. The $4 billion question. Now let's talk about the number that makes every taxpayer uncomfortable. According to NASA's own Inspector General, each SLS launch costs an estimated $4.1 billion. Not the rocket program total, not the cumulative development budget. One single launch. And what does that $4.1 billion buy you now? A rocket that carries Orion to low Earth orbit. That's the same altitude a SpaceX Falcon 9 can reach for roughly $67 million. The same altitude that commercial crew vehicles visit routinely, $4.1 billion. To go to the parking lot. Now, to be fair, SLS is a different class of rocket. It's heavy lift. It can carry significantly more mass than a Falcon 9. And Orion is a larger, more capable spacecraft than Dragon. But the honest conversation that NASA and Congress haven't fully had in public is this. If Starship works, if it really, fully works, does SLS have a future at all? Starship is designed to carry 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit. SLS Block 1 carries about 95 metric tons. They're in the same weight class. But Starship is designed to be fully reusable, meaning the cost per launch, once the system matures, could drop to tens of millions of dollars. Not billions. That's not a small gap. That's a canyon. And SpaceX just went public, with a valuation that signals the market believes Starship will work. Institutional investors don't commit that kind of capital to a rocket that stays on the ground. So the uncomfortable question is this. Is NASA restructuring Artemis 3 because it genuinely makes the mission safer and more flexible? Or because SLS is being sidelined, and nobody in power is willing to say it directly? Let's meet the people who are going to do this. Randy Bresnik is the commander. He's a former Marine Corps fighter pilot and test pilot. He's logged over 150 days in space on the International Space Station. He knows how to operate in hostile environments. He knows how to stay calm when systems fail. Luca Parmitano is the pilot. He flies for the European Space Agency. And he holds a record most people don't know about. In July 2013, during a spacewalk on the ISS, his helmet began filling with water from a cooling system leak. Not a small amount. Enough to cover his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He could not see. He could barely breathe. He found his way back to the airlock by following the vibration of the tether line with his hands. NASA classified it as one of the most dangerous EVA incidents in ISS history. He kept his composure. He made it back. That kind of calm under pressure is exactly what this mission needs. Frank Rubio and Andre Douglas round out the crew as payload specialists. These 4 people are being asked to test a mission architecture that has never been attempted before. They will live in a blue moon cabin that has never flown humans. They will dock with a starship that has never docked with anything. They will depend on systems that are, in many ways, still being invented. And they said yes. That tells you something about who these people are. But here's the detail that barely made the news cycle. Andre Douglas was originally the backup for Artemis 2. He was the guy who was supposed to watch from the sidelines while others made history. Now he's on Artemis 3, a mission that has become something far more complex, far more experimental, and far more demanding than anyone originally planned. Was that a promotion, or did the mission just get significantly harder? The SpaceX IPO and what it actually means for space. On June 10th, 2025, SpaceX went public. The IPO opened at $135 per share. Within 2 days, it climbed to $200. As of this recording, it's settled around $185. Based on the share price and total outstanding shares at peak, the implied valuation reached an estimated $350 billion, placing it among the largest IPOs in American history. Larger than Facebook's market debut. Larger than Alibaba's. Larger than almost anything Wall Street has seen in the modern era. But here's what the financial headlines missed. This wasn't just a money event. This was a signal. When a company goes public, it opens its books, at least partially, to scrutiny. And what SpaceX's numbers showed was a company generating real revenue at real scale right now. Starlink alone has millions of paying subscribers globally. The launch business is the most active on Earth. The cash flow is real and growing. That matters for Artemis because they are not a startup racing against a funding cliff. They are now a publicly traded company with institutional investors, quarterly earnings calls, and a direct financial incentive to make Starship operational as fast as possible. Wall Street is now watching every Starship flight, and immediately after the IPO closed, SpaceX moved to finalize the acquisition of Cursor, the AI-assisted coding platform, which means SpaceX is now officially both a space company and an AI company operating at scale. That combination should make every competitor in both industries nervous. Because if Starship's engineering development benefits from AI-assisted design iteration, faster simulations, faster anomaly detection, faster materials analysis, then the distance between SpaceX and every other player in this industry doesn't hold steady. It grows every quarter. China's piece of this story. Here's something the mainstream space coverage keeps underweighting. While SpaceX was going public and Artemis was being restructured, China conducted 5 separate rocket launches in the span of 10 days. 5. A classified communications satellite into geostationary orbit on a Long March 5. A constellation of Earth observation satellites. Navigation satellites into sun-synchronous orbit. And a new upgraded version of the Zhuk 2E rocket, which, on this flight, suffered an upper stage breakup after reaching orbit, creating a debris field that required multiple Starlink satellites to perform avoidance maneuvers. China is not waiting. And here's the technical detail that puts this in sharp context. On June 17th, China's Long March 12 launch carried 9 Guowan constellation satellites. The press release confirmed something unusual. They used a new synthesized high-energy kerosene fuel for the first time. Here's what that means in plain terms. Regular kerosene is a mixture of carbon chains, molecules that look like tangled strings. Now, if you force those carbon chains into a very tight loop, almost like coiling a spring too tightly, they store extra energy in the tension of that shape. When they burn, they release not just the chemical energy from combustion, but also the stored mechanical energy from the strain. The result is approximately 8 additional seconds of specific impulse. That translates to roughly 2.5% more performance from the same rocket, the same engines, and the same amount of fuel. 2.5% sounds trivial. In orbital mechanics, it is not. It is the margin between a payload that reaches its target orbit and one that falls short. The Soviet Union developed an identical concept in the 1970s and 80s, a fuel called synton. They eventually stopped using it because the manufacturing cost outweighed the performance benefit for most missions. China just announced they've revived and implemented this technology, which means one of two things. Either they've found a way to produce it more cheaply than the Soviets could, or they've identified specific high-priority missions where the cost is justified. Neither conclusion is comfortable from a competitive standpoint. While the United States debates SLS per launch costs and Starship development timelines, China is methodically upgrading the chemistry of its rocket propellants. The moon race. Nobody wants to call a race. Let's be direct about something. NASA and the White House have consistently avoided framing this as a race with China. Politically, that framing is complicated. It implies urgency. It implies the real possibility of losing. It implies the current pace may not be adequate. But the engineering reality tells a different story. China has formally announced its intention to land humans on the moon before 2030. They have the launch vehicles. They have active spacecraft programs. They have the funding. And critically, they have a government structure that does not require congressional authorization hearings to adjust a timeline. The Artemis 3 mission, as currently structured, is targeting a 90-day stay in low Earth orbit. Not a moon landing, not a lunar flyby, a test mission at the altitude of the space station. The actual crewed moon landing has no firm public date, no locked schedule, no confirmed launch window. China, meanwhile, is not restructuring their lunar program around test missions in low Earth orbit. They are building directly toward a surface landing. So the question that every person funding this program through their taxes deserves a clear answer to is this. Is Artemis 3, as it's now designed, a genuine step toward putting Americans on the moon before China does? Or is it a way of maintaining the appearance of momentum while the actual goal drifts further into the future? Call it pessimistic if you want, but it is the only question that actually matters right now, and nobody with a budget and a title is answering it. One more piece of this puzzle that received almost no coverage. SpaceX has begun active preparation of Launch Complex 6, known as Slick 6, at Vandenberg Space Force Base on California's coast. This site has a layered history worth understanding. It was originally constructed for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory in the 1960s, a classified Air Force program that would have placed military astronauts in polar orbit to operate reconnaissance cameras. That program was canceled in 1969 before a single crewed flight. The site was later rebuilt for West Coast space shuttle launches, a capability that was abandoned after the Challenger accident in 1986 fundamentally changed NASA's operational priorities. Most recently, it served as the West Coast launch pad for the Delta IV rocket, which has now been retired. SpaceX is demolishing the remaining Delta IV infrastructure and rebuilding the site for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy operations. That is the official statement. But consider what it actually means structurally. A West Coast launch site engineered to handle Falcon Heavy, with its 27 Merlin engines and 70-meter height, is a site that, with targeted upgrades, could accommodate Starship. The infrastructure requirements overlap significantly. Vandenberg's geographic position enables polar and sun-synchronous orbital trajectories that Boca Chica in Texas cannot efficiently reach. These are precisely the orbits used for national reconnaissance satellites, Earth observation systems, and certain Department of Defense mission profiles. A Starship operating from Vandenberg would open mission categories that are currently inaccessible from the existing Texas launch site. SpaceX has not announced a West Coast Starship facility, but in the SpaceX operational pattern, infrastructure preparation consistently precedes formal announcements by 6 to 18 months. The groundwork is being laid, quietly, methodically. Watch this site. What Flight 13 actually needs to prove. So let's bring it back to July. To Flight 13. What does this test flight actually need to accomplish? Not just for SpaceX's internal development program, but for the entire interconnected architecture we've been describing across this video. First, re-entry survival. The ship must pass through the upper atmosphere at hypersonic velocities, roughly 25 times the speed of sound, without heat shield failure. Flight 12 showed measurable progress. Flight 13 needs to show that the progress was systematic and repeatable. A one-time survival is a data point. 2 consecutive survivals is the beginning of a pattern engineers can rely on. Second, precision landing. SpaceX needs to demonstrate that the ship can touch down within a predictable, defined zone, whether in the ocean or back at the launch facility, with enough consistency that mission planners can model it accurately. Docking with Orion in low Earth orbit requires a vehicle whose terminal flight behavior is understood and controllable. An unpredictable landing profile signals an unpredictable vehicle. Third, systems integrity after re-entry. Landing is necessary. It is not sufficient. Every critical system aboard, life support interfaces, navigation hardware, docking mechanisms, thermal management, must remain functional after the full thermal and mechanical stress of re-entry. For a crewed mission, a vehicle that survives re-entry with a non-functional docking port is a vehicle that cannot complete its assigned mission. There is no partial credit in human spaceflight. Fourth, schedule discipline. SpaceX has publicly committed to Flight 13 in July and Flight 14 in August. That is a 1-month interval between major orbital test flights during active vehicle development. Maintaining that cadence, not just achieving it once, is itself a demonstration of manufacturing and operational maturity. The Artemis program's planning assumptions are built around SpaceX delivering on this pace. Every week of schedule slip ripples forward through a timeline that has very little margin remaining. Flight 13 is not carrying payload to orbit. It is carrying the credibility of an entire program on its airframe. And if it succeeds, if it achieves all 4 of those objectives cleanly, then the conversation around Starship changes in a way that no press release or earnings call can manufacture. Because then Flight 14 stops being a test. It becomes a dress rehearsal. And a crewed Starship flight stops being a long-term aspiration. It becomes a date on a calendar. July is closer than it looks, and now you know exactly what's at stake. We'll be watching closely. If this analysis added value, like, share, and subscribe to the Space Brief. Drop your thoughts below. Hit the screen for more.